She thought she was just moving into a new home, but what she got was a living nightmare. Strange noises in the walls, floating lights, and doors opening on their own were only the beginning. Then, the messages appeared. Her ex-husband's name scribbled all over her closet in red. And when she finally called for help, paranormal investigators ran from the house in terror. But the most horrifying moment? One investigator was yanked into the attic and left dangling from the rafters by something they couldn't see. Was this house cursed? Possessed? Or was something even more sinister lurking inside? Stick around, because this terrifying true story will make you think twice before turning off the lights. In 1989, a 23-year-old woman named Jackie Hernandez had recently parted ways with her husband, Al Hernandez. Their separation was mutual, no animosity, just an understanding that they weren't meant to be together anymore. Despite this, they remained committed to co-parenting their 2 children. With this new chapter in her life unfolding, Jackie relocated to a modest house in San Pedro, California, determined to rebuild her life. She was juggling multiple jobs, studying at night, and shouldering the weight of single parenthood. The stress was immense, but she pressed on, trying to create a stable environment for her kids. About a month into her stay at the new house, Jackie returned home after an exhausting day filled with work and classes. The children were already asleep, and she finally had a moment to unwind. She turned on the television, hoping to relax, but soon noticed an unusual sound. Tiny objects, almost like pebbles, seemed to be dropping inside the walls. She muted the TV, listening intently. The noise was sporadic but persistent. Pressing her ear against the wall, she speculated that a rodent or some small animal had found its way into the attic, dislodging debris into the hollow spaces of the structure. Then, something else caught her attention. She thought she heard faint footsteps above. It startled her, but after straining her ears for confirmation and hearing nothing further, she dismissed the idea. Perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her. Maybe just the exhaustion from her long days of work and study. A few days later, Jackie invited her friend Susan over for some company. With the kids tucked in bed, the 2 women sat in the living room, unwinding in conversation. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. They both froze. Earlier, Jackie had briefly mentioned to Susan that she suspected an animal was living in the attic due to the noises she'd heard. But now, this sound was different, louder, more unsettling. They cautiously walked into the kitchen, their hearts pounding. What they found was peculiar. A framed picture that had been hanging on the wall had fallen, which in itself wasn't strange. But the nails that had secured it were now eerily standing upright beside it, perfectly balanced on their pointed ends. It defied logic. If the picture had simply slipped off the wall, the nails should have scattered randomly, not landed in such an uncanny arrangement. Both women stared in silence, unsure of how to process what they were seeing. Susan was more willing to connect this oddity to the noises Jackie had previously described, but she didn't want to alarm her friend, who was already dealing with so much. They exchanged nervous glances but chose to avoid delving deeper into the subject. Without further discussion, they gathered the fallen picture and nails, putting them away. Susan, clearly unsettled, decided to head home early that night. The following evening, Susan introduced Jackie to a teenage babysitter named Tina. Feeling overwhelmed with stress, Jackie welcomed the idea of stepping out for a bit while Tina watched the kids. Jackie hadn't shared anything about the strange occurrences in the house, so Tina had no reason to be on edge. As the night progressed, Tina sat in the living room, casually keeping an ear out for the children. Suddenly, she felt an odd sensation, something that urged her to check on them. As she approached one of the bedrooms, she reached for the door handle, but before her fingers made contact, the door eerily swung open on its own. She hesitated but then dismissed it as a trick of the wind or an uneven floor. She stepped inside, checked on the children, and, finding them sound asleep, turned to leave. As soon as she shut the door, she heard it creak open again behind her. A chill ran down her spine. Trying to remain rational, she reasoned that perhaps the floor wasn't level or that the door frame had some issues. When Jackie returned home, Tina recounted the strange event. hoping for an explanation. But instead of reassuring her with a simple answer, Jackie's reaction was one of visible concern. Seeing Jackie's unease made Tina even more nervous. She cautiously asked, "Do you know why this might be happening?" Jackie hesitated before admitting that she, too, had experienced some strange occurrences in the house. The two discussed it briefly but ultimately decided that there was no real connection between the events. The next night, Jackie once again asked Tina to babysit. While Jackie was going over instructions about the kids' bedtime and meals, Tina suddenly became distracted, her gaze fixated on the upper corner of the kitchen. Jackie noticed her expression and asked, "What is it?" Tina, still staring, hesitantly asked, "Did you install a new light in that corner?" Jackie followed Tina's gaze and was taken aback. A glowing orb-like light hovered near the ceiling, where no light fixture had ever been installed. It was an ethereal, pulsating glow, shifting slightly in place. "What is that?" Jackie murmured. The two women stood frozen, watching as the strange light seemed to move, not toward them, but as if it were subtly drifting in its own space. The unsettling sight left them speechless. Had they told anyone else about this, they would have likely been met with skepticism. A floating, luminous presence in the kitchen sounded absurd, and yet they had both seen it. Faced with the growing number of strange occurrences in her home, Jackie Hernandez decided to document one of the most unsettling events yet. The mysterious orb of light that had appeared in her kitchen was still there, hovering unnaturally, refusing to dissipate. She rushed to grab a camera and captured a photograph, hoping to make sense of what she was witnessing. The image revealed an eerie, glowing mass, indisputable proof that something beyond her understanding was happening in her home. By this point, Jackie had transitioned from rational skepticism to outright fear. The unexplained pebbles trickling through the walls, the phantom footsteps overhead, the falling picture with inexplicably upturned nails, the babysitter's strange experiences with the door, and now this luminous anomaly. Each occurrence chipped away at her sense of security. She felt isolated in her fear, unable to confide in anyone except Susan and Tina. Her children, too young to comprehend, were blissfully unaware, but Jackie was left alone to wrestle with an overwhelming sense of dread. She considered who else she could turn to, but the thought of explaining her predicament to someone who hadn't experienced it firsthand felt impossible. How could she walk into a police station and say, "I'm convinced there's someone or something moving around in my attic, knocking pictures off my walls and arranging nails upright on the floor"? She knew she'd be met with skepticism at best, ridicule at worst. She feared being dismissed or worse, accused of orchestrating the disturbances herself. With no one else to turn to, she reached out to the only person she trusted to listen, her ex-husband, Al. When Al arrived, Jackie hesitated before divulging the full extent of what had been happening. She laid everything out for him. The eerie sounds, the unexplained movements, the picture, the nails, and the glowing light she had captured on film. As she spoke, Al listened, though his skepticism was evident. A part of him wondered if this was less about the house and more about Jackie's emotional state. Was she subconsciously trying to get his attention? Still, not wanting to dismiss her outright, he decided to test the situation in his own way. Standing in the middle of the room, he called out, "If something is here, show yourself." Jackie panicked. "Don't do that," she urged, afraid of provoking whatever force had been lurking in her home. They waited, but nothing happened. Silence stretched between them. No footsteps in the attic, no floating lights, no shifting shadows, just an ordinary, undisturbed house. Al turned to her with an almost triumphant smile. "See, there's nothing to be afraid of," he said, dismissing her fears as imagination running wild. Satisfied that there was no immediate danger, he left. But Jackie was left with an uneasy feeling. As soon as Al walked out the door, she turned to put something away in the closet. The moment she opened it, she froze. Inside, scrawled across the walls, the door, and every available surface was a single name, Al. Written over and over again in red and blue. Her breath caught in her throat. This hadn't been there before. Was this a direct response to AL's challenge? A warning? A message? If she had the financial means to leave, she would have. But she didn't. She was trapped, bound by circumstances to remain in a house that felt increasingly hostile. Unable to keep it bottled up any longer, she confided in Susan about what had happened. The two went for a walk through the neighborhood, discussing Jackie's fear and frustration. By sheer coincidence, they ran into Jackie's landlord. As they exchanged pleasantries, Susan, seeing Jackie's hesitation, took the lead. "Something really strange is going on in her house," she told the landlord. "She's scared to talk about it because she thinks people will think she's crazy." The landlord listened intently as they recounted the bizarre events. The eerie lights, the noises, the unsettling occurrences. A deeply religious person, he took their concerns seriously. "Would you allow me to bring in 2 priests to bless the home?" he asked. Jackie, though religious herself, was unsure. She had hoped the disturbances would stop on their own rather than inviting a spiritual intervention. But she also knew she had no answers and nowhere else to turn. Reluctantly, she agreed. The following day, 2 priests arrived. Jackie's home, usually in a state of disarray from juggling multiple jobs and raising 2 young children, was particularly chaotic that day. The kids were crying, the house was a mess, and stress hung thick in the air. The priests conducted a walkthrough, observing the home and offering to bless her children. However, they didn't provide any clear conclusions or explanations. After their visit, Jackie felt no different. If anything, she felt even more uneasy. Then, the next day, she received a visit from Child Protective Services. The priests had filed a report, claiming that Jackie's belief that her house was haunted was a sign of delusion, suggesting she was an unfit mother. They cited the disorderly state of her home as further proof that her children were at risk. Jackie was devastated. Her worst fear had come true. Seeking help had only made her situation worse. Now, CPS was monitoring her, warning her to keep her home in better condition and implying that further reports could jeopardize her custody of her children. This was a turning point. Jackie realized she could no longer risk talking to anyone who might dismiss her fears as a mental breakdown. For the next few weeks, she moved her children into the living room, refusing to sleep separately from them. She barely rested, her exhaustion and paranoia growing. The burden of the unexplained weighed heavily on her, and she spiraled deeper into fear. Seeing her friend unravel, Susan suggested a different approach. "You need to contact a paranormal investigator," she insisted. "They're the only people who will actually listen to you without making you feel crazy." At first, Jackie resisted. It sounded absurd calling ghost hunters, as if that could fix anything. But Susan made a good point. Even if they didn't find anything, at least they wouldn't dismiss her outright. Desperate, Jackie finally agreed. A few days later, a team of paranormal investigators arrived. They came equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and a deep curiosity about the case. While they took Jackie seriously, they remained skeptical. In fact, they later admitted that after investigating over 3,000 cases, they had never once encountered definitive proof of the paranormal. More often than not, they found logical explanations for the so-called hauntings they were called to investigate. Still, they set up their equipment and began an on-camera interview with Jackie. She described her experiences in detail, recounting every unexplained incident. Then, the power in the house suddenly cut out. Jackie visibly tensed. The investigators, while surprised, weren't convinced this was anything supernatural. It could have been a simple electrical issue. When the lights flickered back on, Jackie's fear deepened. She knew this house. She had lived through its strange occurrences. This wasn't just a coincidence. "I'm telling you," she said, her voice shaking, "there's something in the attic." The investigators decided to check it out. If nothing else, it would help put Jackie's mind at ease. One of them grabbed a ladder and climbed into the small crawl space leading to the attic. Meanwhile, in the other room, Al, who had stayed at the house with their kids, lay awake, waiting. Al wasn't expecting anything to happen. He was lying in the other room with his son, waiting for the night to pass, when something happened that shook him to his core. A whisper, clear, deliberate, and chilling, brushed against his ear. "Tell them to get out of here." It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't a creak in the house or a stray gust of wind. It was a voice. Al, a lifelong skeptic, later admitted in interviews that he had no logical explanation for what he heard. He had spent the entire time dismissing Jackie's fears, attributing them to stress or loneliness. But this was undeniable. Before he could process what had just happened, a piercing scream rang out from the attic. One of the paranormal investigators had gone up there alone to take pictures with his expensive camera. Now he came crashing down through the attic opening, barely catching himself before hitting the floor. His face was drained of color, his breathing rapid and erratic. "Something grabbed my camera," he stammered. "There's nothing up there, but something grabbed it." The other investigators, who had maintained a level of detached skepticism, were now rattled. Al burst into the room, demanding to know what was going on. "My camera," the photographer said again, his voice now shifting from terror to determination. That camera was his livelihood. He had to get it back. Summoning his courage, he climbed back into the attic. But what he found only deepened the mystery. The body of the camera had been placed inside an old wooden crate in one corner of the attic. The lens, however, had been completely detached and set down on the opposite side of the space. Nothing about this made sense. When he returned downstairs with his equipment, his hands were shaking. The investigators, now fully unsettled, were no longer interested in continuing their work that night. Whatever they had planned, whether finishing the interview with Jackie or setting up more monitoring equipment, was abandoned. Jackie, desperate and terrified, pleaded with them to stay, but they wouldn't. They reassured her they'd return soon, but it was clear they wanted out, and fast. Al stayed for a while longer, but eventually he too had to leave. His job required him to be up early, and no matter how much fear now gnawed at him, he couldn't stay. Jackie, however, had no choice. She was alone in the house with her children, and for the first time, she felt like whatever was inside had been angered. That night, Jackie lay curled up on the sofa, too afraid to sleep in her bedroom. The investigators had left, Al was gone, and she had no one left to turn to. She wasn't sure when exhaustion finally overtook her, but at some point, she drifted off. A sudden jolt woke her. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed a figure standing at the foot of the sofa. It was the shape of an old man. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching her children. A wave of horror surged through her. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and just like that, the figure vanished. Without a second thought, she grabbed her kids and fled the house. She needed help, but who would believe her? She was terrified that calling the police would result in more scrutiny from Child Protective Services. If the investigators, people who had seen and heard it for themselves, had run from the house, what could law enforcement do? So, she called the only people she thought might take her seriously, the investigators. No one answered. Desperate, she left a voicemail, her voice trembling with fear. "Please come back. I can't go back in there. I don't know what to do. Please help me." One of the team members, hearing her desperation, made a decision. Despite the late hour, they returned. When they arrived, they found Jackie outside, still in her pajamas, holding her children close. She was visibly shaken, too afraid to step foot back inside. The investigators cautiously entered the home, half expecting chaos. But instead, everything was still. The house was silent, too silent. After a while, the absence of activity gave them a strange sense of confidence. Perhaps whatever had been happening was tied to Jackie's fear. Maybe they had let paranoia take hold of them. Just to be thorough, two of them decided to go back into the attic. They wanted to take a few photos and video recordings. Nothing more. Jackie and the third investigator stayed below, anxiously watching the attic entrance. Up above, the two men moved carefully, scanning their surroundings with a flashlight. "Nothing up here," one of them called down. "It's quiet." Then came the sound. Snap. Then another. Snap. And a third. Snap. The air in the attic became heavy, almost suffocating. Jackie's chest tightened with a sense of impending doom. The investigators tried to keep calm, muttering rational explanations to themselves. But Jackie, below, was no longer listening. Her instincts were screaming at her. "Get out of there," she urged. "Come back down. Now." They hesitated, then agreed. But as they turned to leave, something happened that none of them could ever forget. The investigator holding the flashlight was yanked backward with such force that he disappeared into the darkness. The remaining investigator, now alone in the pitch-black attic, had no idea what had just happened. He couldn't see anything. The only light source had gone with the man who had been pulled away. Panic surged through him. He reached for the only tool he had left, his camera. With no other way to illuminate his surroundings, he began frantically snapping pictures, using the brief flashes to see. Below, Jackie and the third investigator screamed for answers. What's happening? With each camera flash, he caught glimpses of the attic in short bursts. And then, a photo revealed something horrifying. The missing investigator was suspended in midair, tied to the rafters, as though something unseen had bound him there. The other investigator lunged forward, struggling to untie him. The man was still alive but completely disoriented, as if he had blacked out and regained consciousness in a nightmare. They freed him, grabbed their equipment, and bolted out of the attic. What they saw left them speechless. His neck bore deep red marks, as if invisible hands had restrained him. He was gasping for air, too shaken to explain how he had ended up tied in the rafters. That was it. The investigators ran from the house and never returned. Jackie never experienced another paranormal event after that night. To this day, she insists that nothing about her experience was a false information. If anything, it was one of the darkest periods of her life, a time that left her feeling vulnerable, judged, and alone. Many dismissed her claims, calling her crazy or desperate for attention. But the investigators, they never questioned what they had seen. They had photographic evidence, and they had scars, both physical and emotional, that would never let them forget. A single mother trapped in a haunted house, a ghost hunter nearly strangled by an unseen force, and a chilling whisper that warned them to get out. Was Jackie Hernandez's house truly cursed? Or was this all part of something even darker? Whatever was inside that attic, it never wanted to be found. What do you think happened? Drop your theories in the comments. And if you love real-life horror stories that will keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, the next one might be even worse.